Right, guys. Surviving as a tank. Here we go. So, tank survival is the absolute main priority for all situations as a tank. If you're a tank that's not alive, the entire group's going to die. You're going to cause a lot of problems for your groups. So, it's absolutely pivotal that you do not die. When you start out as a tank, survival is one of your biggest obstacles alongside sustain. And your ability to survive really does depend a lot on sort of what you do as a tank, how experienced you are, how well you know each situation. Obviously, again, you sustain and the group that you're with. So sometimes, if you're a beginner tank and you're with other beginner players, you're going to struggle in that environment with the healing potentially because you're going to have new healers, you're going to have new group members. So those things can all be problems. So how do we survive as a tank? Well, quite a few different methods that we can use. We've got experience in whatever it is that you're doing. Blocking is the absolute first thing, is the main thing that's going to help us survive. Block casting abilities. Bar swapping and timing your bar swaps. Self-buffing, giving yourself buffs to stay alive. Debuffing your enemies so that they don't hit as hard. Your resistances. Self-healing. Roll dodging, potions, and at the end, sustain. So, first of all, tank experience. The number one key to not dying as a tank is having experience in the fights that you're doing. So, doing the same content repeatedly, you start to learn different patterns and different ways that the mechanics work, the movements of bosses, the abilities that they do, how much damage they do, all that kind of stuff. So you're able to kind of adjust over time by learning fights, watching videos, asking for advice from other people, that sort of thing. That's why the Tank for Discord exists. So that's why it's there. It's so you can kind of go along and ask people for advice on how do you deal with this high damage situation? How do you deal with this mechanic? Obviously, it is possible that you can go into content blind and not know what you're doing, but people are going to be less willing to kind of allow you to go and tank something with absolutely zero ability of learning or knowing what you're supposed to be doing. Initially, the way that you want to learn fights in this game is by using high health, high resistances, comfortable gear sets. Everything that's going to keep you alive is your absolute priority when you're first learning. And then later on, you move on to group assistance sets. Sets that are going to give you group buffs, such as Alkosh, that kind of thing. You don't need to use them when you're learning a fight for the first time. That's one of the big mistakes a lot of people make. They go in, all guns blazing, they haven't got a clue what they're doing. They're wearing gear sets that are not suitable for a beginner player. So you need to kind of think about what it is you're doing and work towards that situation. So try to read about how to do fights, try watching other people complete fights. Do keep in mind, though, that trying to copy a video of 4D, for example, completing VMO is not going to be any benefit to you as a learning tank, because they're going to do some crazy strategy where they kill it without even doing a prayer phase, for example. That's not realistic to how you're going to experience that fight. So you have to be careful. When you're looking at world records and really, really high score clears, that's not going to help you by watching those clips of how to do stuff. You need to watch clips that are relative to your experience. Watch somebody clear VMOL for the first time. Watch a progression team getting their first clear. Don't watch world record scores, because that is not how it's going to play out for you when you're in that environment yourself. Blocking. So it might sound really obvious, but blocking is obviously the most critical way of surviving. Now, when you hold block, you are mitigating 50% of the incoming damage. It's the first thing that's there. So if you're not blocking, you take 100% of the damage. When you hold your shield, it's 50%. You half the amount of damage you're taking straight away. You need to be able to sustain to maintain block. So you've got to follow the strategy of heavy attacking after a heavy attack, so you can sustain your block. And obviously, we're going to put the link in the chat for the sustain guide, which is on YouTube. So you have to really be, you can't just instantly, permanently block. You have got to be playing your sustain as well. So heavy after a heavy is the way we do that. If you're out of stamina or get crowd controlled by an enemy, the best thing to do is to quickly drop your block and reblock. Because often, if you don't do that, what can happen is your character might look like they're blocking, but they're not actually blocking, and then you'll take a full damage hit. So the best way to make sure that your character is always blocking is if you get stunned, knocked back, crowd controlled, you run out of stamina, let go of block, re-hold it again. That will make sure that you are actually blocking, because there's so many times when people say, I was blocking and I died, I was blocking and I got stunned, or this or that or whatever. If any of those things happen to you as a tank, you need to drop your block and reblock again. That's the best way to make sure that your character is actually always maintaining that block. Block casting. So some people don't actually know what block casting means. Block casting is the technique of casting abilities while continuing to block. So when you're maintaining your block doesn't get dropped. You're holding block, you're casting abilities through block. Most abilities that are used by a tank can be block cast. And it's a good idea to test the abilities on a target skeleton. So go to the target skeleton, hold block, look at your character, look for the shield icon, and press your abilities to see, does it drop your block, does it not drop your block, so you know which abilities are safe. Sometimes it's a good idea not to use abilities that are not safe and just play it in a way where you are really comfortable and really safe. In veteran content, especially, you've got to block cast quite frequently. It's ultra safe. It'll lower the incoming damage while you're using abilities. You should be doing it anyway. You can do it. And some people don't seem to realise that actually most of your abilities are safe. The only things that you cannot block cast are abilities that have got a channel or a cast time. So Stone Giant, the Dragon Knight ability, the first cast of that, your character stomps the ground, you drop block. That's not a safe ability. You can't block cast it. After the initial cast, you can block cast the rest of it until the orbs expire, but you need to really be careful for that one. Dark Deal, the sorcerer skill, is another common skill that you'll use as a tank. You can't block cast Dark Deal either. It'll actually prevent you from bar swapping for a quick second as well. So that is a really tricky one to work with when you're first starting out. So you have to be really careful of abilities like that. But generally, your taunts, all your healing skills, all your crowd control, your blockade, all those sorts of skills can be block cast. They're safe to use, and you should be actively block casting them rather than dropping your block and then casting them. When you get experienced with tanking, you'll know when you can and cannot block, which attacks you can do. Light attack weaving is a thing on a tank, but you don't do that when you're first learning. So this is aimed more towards players that are obviously beginning their tank journey rather than veteran experienced tanks who won't be needing to do this as much because they will be light attack weaving in between their abilities. Bar swapping. So bar swapping is something that kills quite a lot of tanks. When you bar swap, you drop block. So when you switch to your other bar, you've got that split second in between when you're going from your front bar to your back bar. You're actually not holding block. So if you bar swap during the middle of an attack or a mechanic, that classes as you're taking an unblocked hit from a boss or whatever. So the amount of damage that you'll take is considerable, and you have to be extremely careful when you do that. You need to time bar swapping. So you should only bar swap instantly after you've blocked an attack. The same way where we do the heavy after a heavy attack when we're sustaining, we should only bar swap after an attack. So even if it's a light attack, a heavy attack, no matter what it is, take the hit, then bar swap. Bosses generally hit every 2 seconds. There isn't really any bosses in the game that hit 1 second, then 1 second, then 1 second, and it's hitting very, very quickly. There are certain mechanics where you get hit like that, such as the Dragon's Breath hits every half a second, but that's only for a small point of the fight. It doesn't hit like that all the way through. If you use an ice staff on your back bar, this makes it a bit safer for you bar swapping. So if you bar swap and you're on your back bar and you notice that there's a mechanic about to happen, you shouldn't panic bar swap back to your front bar and take an unblocked hit. It's better to just try and take the hit on the staff than it is to bar swap. Sometimes with a lightning staff you can also take the hit, but when you use an ice staff, you've actually got the benefit that it acts similar to how a shield would. You mitigate some of the damage with an ice staff, so using an ice staff on your back bar can be a safe option to allow you to be bar swapping safely, and if you get stuck on the wrong bar mid-mechanic, you can stay on it, because the ice staff is a very safe weapon to use if you're on your back bar. And you can definitely take hits and heavy attacks and things like that with an ice staff. It's just not as good as a shield because you do lose a bit of resistances. Self-buffing. So self-buffing is obviously something that you should be doing as a tank. It'll help you deal with damage and stay alive. So one of the main survival buffs is Major Resolve, which gives you your spell and physical resistance. And every class has their own way of doing this, as well as there's abilities that you can use that are available to every class. So obviously the Dragon Knight has spiked armor, the Warden has Frost Cloak, Sorcerer's got Lightning Form, Necromancer has Bone Armor, Templar has the Rune Focus, the Nightblade has the Shadow Barrier passive. All tanks of all classes have the option of using Balance, Unstoppable, and you can gain it from Men's Spirit as well, which is if somebody is using... It's the other morph of Symbiosis and they're using the attacks on you, you also give resistances. But this is the first and main buff that you should maintain 100%. If you are new to tanking, the first and absolutely main buff is Taunt and Major Resolve. They're the two things you need to maintain at all times. You get over 5k resistances, which is a considerable amount. Each 600 resistances is the equivalent to 1% damage mitigation. So getting over 5k resistances is quite an important thing. One of the other ones that we can use is Minor Protection. It's another common buff that we get as a tank. It can be obtained by Ransack Dark Cloak. It's a passive buff that we get by slotting Temporal Guard, not using it. You also get it on a Necromancer from Bone Totem, the Spear Wall passive on a Templar, and Circle of Protection from the Fighters Guild. And Minor Protection is a small buff for yourself. The only problem with Minor Protection is it comes out right at the end of the equation. So when in the background all of your damage mitigation's being figured out by your resistances, your champion points, your blocking, all that kind of thing, Minor Protection is one of the last things to come off. So it's the least beneficial buff really, but it will help in extremely high damage situations. Any buffs that provide you with a personal boost in resistances, damage reduction, damage mitigation, healing received, additional resources, they're all the sort of buffs that you need to be aiming for self-buffing as a tank to keep yourself alive. So things such as Major and Minor Vitality and Mending, which will increase like your healing received and healing done. Major and Minor Protection, which reduces the damage that you take. Evasion, which avoids damage. Heroism, which is going to boost the speed at which you gain in Ultimate. Minor Aegis, Lifesteal, Healing Taken, anything healing done, resistance or recovery. These are the buffs that you want to look at and you want to focus on as a tank to try and increase your survivability. Enemy debuffing is something we can also do as a tank, and the main one that we do as a tank to reduce the amount of damage that the bosses do is Minor Maim, which reduces their damage by 15%. This will be changed with the next patch, so you just need to be aware of that. It does get reduced. It's not going to be 15% anymore. I think it goes down to 5%. But we can keep up Minor Maim very easily with Heroic Slash. And it's quite an easy buff. A debuff to maintain on an enemy target. We can also partner that with things like the Lady Thorn monster set, which is quite a good monster set. When we use Major Maim and we get Minor Maim as well, combined together, we reduce the enemy damage by 45%. So things like this are extremely good for reducing enemy damage. If you're really good with timing things, Lady Thorn can be great. You can time your Lady Thorn, activate the synergy, reduce the enemy's damage by a huge amount. You're nearly halving the amount of damage that a boss does with the combination of Minor Maim, Major Maim from Lady Thorn and Heroic Slash. Other things that you can do to debuff an enemy, you can use like Weakening Glyphs, which will just reduce the amount of damage they do very slightly. It's a small thing, but something that you can do quite effectively, because you can put a Weakening Glyph on your front bar. That'll reduce the enemy's weapon and spell damage, but it's only by a very small amount, and it doesn't combine very well with things like Minor and Major Maim. Vicosa and Power Extraction. So Vicosa is obviously a monster set. Power Extraction is a Nightblade skill that reduces the enemy's weapon and spell damage as well. Now these two things, they don't combine very well. They're not additive, so they don't add on top of Major and Minor Maim. They become less effective with the more things you add into the debuff. So they are things that you can use, but they're not absolutely vital because they have less and less of an effect the more things that you use to reduce the enemy's damage. Resistances. So resistance cap is 33,000 physical and 33,000 spell resistance. Quite a lot of people will say that resistances are not important. Now, resistances do play quite an important part in tanking. If you take a lot of damage in any fight, so this is something you need to play with personally as like your own character. This is something that you will decide and dictate. So you've got to really just figure it out for yourself. If you're doing a fight, you're fighting a boss and you think, well, I'm getting hit really, really hard, you need to consider increasing your resistances closer to 33k. Because the closer you get to 33k, the less damage the enemy's going to do to you because you're mitigating more damage. Every 600 resistance is the equivalent of 1% damage mitigation. Now, the thing with resistance is, again, it comes out at the end of the equation when it comes to like your damage mitigation. So the first things are your block, your champion points, your resistances comes out late in the equation. So the resistances do have like the least effect compared to champion points and blocking, but they are still extremely vital depending on how much damage you take. High resistances is not important in older content. Things like AA, you can run that entire trial in a DD setup as a tank. The old dungeons, you don't even need a tank. Even on Vet, you don't need like an actual tank that's set up as a tank for Vet dungeons, the base game ones especially. You can do them as a DD with a taunt. That's really how like low they are in terms of the amount of damage they do. When you start to get into the newer content, so the new DLC dungeons, things like Stone Garden, that is a high damage environment. Kind's Aegis, extremely high damage trial. Things like the Cloudrest portals, all that sort of thing, they're high damage situations where having high resistances is extremely important. But things that are older content is not high hitting. The damage is very low, resistances are less important. But when the damage is extremely high, then you need to consider adding more resistances in. The lower the CP you are, the more resistances are more important because you do have a lot of mitigation coming from Hardy, Elemental Defender, and Ironclad. If you don't have any CP, obviously you're missing out on a lot of percentage worth of damage mitigation. So that's when resistances are most important. When you are low CP and you're trying to do content, you're getting hit really hard. That's because you've got less CP into the main trees that you need them in, so you should consider adding more resistances to combat those problems. Ways that you can increase your resistances, obviously you can use the Lady Munderstone. That is probably the best way to do it, and if you're not a Nord, that would be the easiest way to get your resistances up without affecting too many other things such as your sustain. You can use the Reinforced Chest Piece. Now, the Reinforced Chest is good because it's the biggest slot your character has, so when you increase that to Reinforced, it's got quite a massive difference, and it will add quite a lot. Choosing the Nord is always a good option to choose if you want to try and increase your resistances without having to spend too much effort into other areas. And the Nord also comes obviously with max health and stam, which is good for tanking. Golding out your armor will increase resistances. Using 6 or 7 heavy instead of 5-1-1. You can use a defending one-handed weapon because your front bar weapon is the least effective one in terms of group utility, so you can use a defending one-hander. And then finally, using the Lord Warden monster set or something like a one-piece Lord Warden, one-piece Mighty Chudan will also work because it's 2 resistance pieces on the one piece. So they're all ways that you can increase your resistances. Self-healing. Now, self-healing plays a big part in surviving. Self-healing is needed in dungeons with no healer. And sometimes you'll need it in trial situations if the healers die or if the healers aren't very experienced. There's a good chance that you'll need to figure out a way to keep yourself alive as well. Now, there's 3 methods that you'll use for self-healing. You've got burst healing, so something like green dragon blood, something like the Clanfear. That is something that is a burst heal. You've got healing over time, so something like Cinderstorm is a good heal over time. Leeching Vines on a Warden, that's a heal over time. And then finally, health recovery. So when you've got your health recovery, that's something that's always ticking every 2 seconds in the background. You'll get health benefits from that. Self-healing does require you to have quite high magicka recovery. And when you're doing new content, you might opt for healing gear, which we'll talk about later. But there is some gear sets that you can use that will kind of heal you in content. Some of it is not very consistent. Some of it is fairly consistent. It really depends what sort of options you choose from that. Healing over time is when you use a heal that has a long duration and it will heal you occasionally for a certain amount. So something generally that's every 1 second, 2 seconds, like I said before. Cinderstorm, which is a Dragon Knight ability. You cast it onto the ground, you stand in it, it's there for, I think, 16 seconds. It heals you for over 1k health every second. So that is a really good heal over time, and it's a good way to maintain your health so that you're not wasting consistent amounts of magicka. Like, you don't want to be using a burst heal when you've only lost a little bit of health, but you also don't want to risk being too low health in case you get a heavy attack. You don't want to die from a heavy attack because you didn't have enough health because you didn't heal yourself that little bit of health. But then, if you're a Dragon Knight, you won't be using green dragon blood unless you're at low health because it's a burst heal that scales off how low your health is. So you should always consider using heal over times, especially if you're newer to tanking. You're doing dungeons with no healer. Leeching Vines, like I say, is a good one for the Warden. You cast that, it puts a vine around you, that heals you for a number of seconds. Even things that are quite low in healing, over time, they do add up. So putting down an extended ritual on a Templar tank is not going to heal you for very much. But when you consider the amount of time that it's going to be there, it's going to heal you for quite a lot because it's over a period of time, and it's also going to heal people in your group. Burst healing is when you need to... you need a big heal to recover from taking a big hit. So you shouldn't be using things like green dragon blood when you've lost 5% of your health or 10% of your health. It's a burst heal, and they will heal for 20, 30, 40k sometimes, depending on how much health you've got and how much health you've got missing. It's expensive to recast burst healing, so you don't want to do it too soon. You don't want to do it when you haven't lost enough health. So it is an expensive way of staying alive, but you need to wait until you absolutely need it to make the most out of it. Most classes do have a boost, like a big burst heal suitable for tanking. So the DK's got green dragon blood. You've got the Clanfear on a Sork. You've got Polar Wind on a Warden. You've got the Hungry Scythe on the Necro. What have I missed? Nightblade has Dark Cloak. Sorry, Dark Cloak, which is a heal over time, but it's a big heal over time. So it's a bit stronger than a heal over time, but it's not as strong as an actual full burst heal. One of the most critical things about burst healing is to make sure that you've got points into the champion points. In the blue CP, you can gain critical healing quite easily because these burst heals can crit. So the base heal might be 30k or 20k, but it can heal for 40k when it crits. If you've got the Vengeance passive in your champion points, that's by putting 10 CP into the Apprentice. I think if you take 3 magicka hits, your next magicka ability will be a crit, which includes crit healing. So your magicka healing will crit as well. So that's a good way to make sure you get a crit heal is you take 3 magicka hits and then you use your heal and it'll crit and it'll give you a massive heal. And then you've also got things that can boost your healing, such as the DK using an Igneous Shield before Green Dragon Blood's going to give you major mending. The same on a Warden, you can use Leeching Vines when you're low health. That procs major mending, and that will also give you a big heal. So those are things that you should consider as well. Giving yourself health boosting things before using your burst heal to give it a bit more oomph. Health recovery is a stat that all characters have. Your health recovery ticks every 2 seconds. You gain health recovery from all sorts of stuff. So your heavy armor passives, you've got sometimes in class passives, you get health recovery from potions, from major fortitude. So when you drink a potion, you get major fortitude. That increases your health recovery by 20%. Using Bewitched Sugar Skulls food is another thing that gives health recovery. And it's a pretty reliable way to get a little bit of health every 2 seconds. So if your health recovery is at sort of 1k standard, that's pretty standard. If you're using potions that also give a bit of health over time, you're using maybe the Steed Munda Stone, which also gives health recovery. For some content, that's a viable option. And also using Troll King as a monster set option, you can get your health recovery quite high to 4k, 3 to 4k. And that means every 2 seconds you're going to get a 3 or 4k automatic heal that you haven't got to control. You haven't got to press anything. You haven't got to do anything. You've got to use no resources. You're just going to get that boost of health. Roll dodging. So roll dodging is probably one of the most underused things that I've ever seen from new players. People seem to not know what dodge rolling actually does. So when you roll dodge, you evade damage for about the next 2 seconds from anything that's not like a locked in channeled attack on you. So when you roll dodge, you avoid the damage altogether. So for example, when we're on Sunspire and we've got the Dragon's Breath, we allow the dragon to breathe the first 2 seconds and then we dodge roll for the second set of 2 seconds because we don't have to take all the damage. If you stand still inside the Dragon Breath, you're going to take constant damage. You could potentially die. It's a lot of damage. If you just dodge roll halfway through the ability, you avoid the damage. And that's what dodge rolling does, is you don't have to be hit for prolonged periods of time through stuff that's not locked in. Now, it can be tricky to figure out what's an attack that I can and can't dodge roll. So locked in attacks like Dark Barrage from Rakat the Machine Gun, you can't dodge roll it. If you try and dodge roll, you're going to die. Nocturnal's Favour from Zamaja in Cloud Rest, that's locked onto your character. If you dodge roll, you can't avoid it by dodge rolling. You're going to die. But anything that's not fixed onto your character can be roll dodged, can be avoided. You don't have to take the hit. And it's good practice to get into the habit of dodge rolling at critical points when you're taking too much damage. The majority of the attacks in the game aren't locked onto you, and you can just dodge roll to avoid it. So when you're on the Warrior in Hel Ra, when he's doing his 1,000 cuts, you can dodge roll. If your healer's not keeping you alive, rather than die, just dodge roll. Like that is something that people need to be doing more than they do already, because people don't dodge roll, people die. You don't have to take the damage. You can just avoid it. And it's much better to dodge roll and get the boss out of position rather than just taking the damage and dying. Like if you die, it's a bigger problem than getting a boss out of position. So if something's out of position, it can be fixed. You can put it back in position. You can reposition a boss. You can refocus on what you're doing. Whereas if you just stand there and take damage and you've decided not to dodge roll and you die, obviously that's a much bigger problem. Roll dodging is a good tactic to use in critical situations where you've taken a big hit, you're overwhelmed, you might have done a bar swap by accident, you've pressed an ability that you didn't mean to, like Stagger. You're trying to do Stagger, you're trying to keep up Stone Giant, you've pressed it by mistake during a heavy attack. And then you just need to instantly dodge roll, react to that situation, react to a big hit. If you're taking too much damage, roll dodge. And that will save you. On so many times, I have not died in a situation because my health's gone really low. And the first thing I do is I don't try and cast a heal because my heal's probably not going to hit me high enough. I need to do a couple of things. And I just dodge roll. The first thing I do is dodge roll and then I heal myself once I've kind of got myself into a situation where I'm comfortable again. So panic healing is not the way to go because you just burn out your resources. The best thing to do is to do a quick roll dodge and then work on your sustain and resources and whatnot afterwards. So honestly, dodge roll is a fantastic way to avoid damage, to stay alive. It's one of the number one things, other than knowing what you're doing, is just dodge rolling and avoiding the damage in a situation. It will very, very often save you from dying. Potions. So timing potions, especially health potions, will give you a quick burst of help. Like if you take a big hit or unexpected damage, you can use a potion that gives you health. Now, you've got to kind of decide how you want to use your potions. So, using potions on cooldown is good because all potions have some kind of benefit over a long term, such as your major fortitude, um, major intellect, which is going to give you magicka recovery. So there is benefits to using potions on cooldown. You get all your recoveries and things. So that is a thing that you need to consider. But you can also consider the fact that you can save a potion for an emergency situation. So if you do take a big hit, you can use you can quickly press your potion and it's going to keep you alive. If you're running out of resources, you take a big hit, you're low on health, you can press a potion. You can see one of the potions just there, the essence of health at the bottom, with the butterfly wings, powder mother of pearl, and the water. Those are like potions that you might use in Cloud Rush, for example, and they give you health per second, they give you major vitality, they give you 8k health immediately, they give you major fortitude. They are like the epitome of the best health potion you can get because it gives you everything you could possibly need for healing and staying alive. And you'd use them at a critical point in a fight. So if you're in a really hard hitting situation, you use it and you save it. You don't use them on cooldown. You don't use them when you don't need them. You save it. You use it when you need that healing, when you need that major vitality, when you need that health per second, and you give yourself a real nice boost. But like I say, there are potions like the standard essence of health, which gives you health, magicka, stamina. It gives you all three recoveries as well. And recovery is important. So you only want to do that in fights. You want to kind of learn a fight and then decide which potion is going to be best. If you're starting to go into content that's new and you don't know how to deal with it, then maybe the expensive essence of health potions at the bottom there that give you all them big healing boosts would be good in a situation where you don't know what to expect or you've never done that trial, you've never done that dungeon before. You could use those, and then when you get more comfortable, you use something more on the sustain side up at the top there. Sustain, so we've already covered sustain in the past. So we do have another sustain presentation similar to this one. So make sure you check that one out if you want to know more about how to sustain as a tank, because that is quite important to your survival. If you don't have any, if you don't have any, if you don't have anything, if you don't have any resources, you're gonna die. It's just as bad not having any sustain as anything else. So if you run out of resources, you'll die if you can't heal or dodge roll or block. Choosing sustain-based gear over self-healing gear is usually better because you don't always need healing. So let's say you pick a set like Leeching Plate. Now, Leeching Plate has got a point where it's good. In a situation where you're taking consistent damage from a lot of ads, Leeching Plate would be a set that you could use to stay alive. The problem is, when you're in a situation where you don't need healing constantly for the entire duration of a fight, it's effectively useless. Sustain gear is better in most situations because you've got that there giving you constant resources to heal yourself, giving you constant resources to block, giving you resources to dodge roll. Resource-based gear is far better for a beginner tank than self-healing gear because you can heal yourself with abilities. But if you run out of sustain, if you run out of resources, you're going to die no matter what healing gear you've got. So you should try and prioritize sustain-based gear over self-healing gear where you can. If you can sustain, you can stay alive. Healing gear can often be wasteful. It will heal you when you don't need it. Like if you've got 100% health and you've got a set of gear, like I'm saying, Leeching Plate, if that's going to keep healing you when you're at 100% health, it's not doing anything. It's a waste of a set. But obviously, when you do need the healing, it's useful. So you need to really consider maybe having different gear sets for different situations and really working around like the situation that you're in. And heavy attack is the best way of sustaining, obviously. Heavy after a heavy is the thing that you always need to think about. Whenever you've took a heavy attack from a boss, return it with a heavy attack because bosses don't do back-to-back heavy attacks. They don't often do back-to-back heavy mechanics. There's plenty of time for you to go along and do that yourself, you heavy straight after. And that's the best way to prevent sustain issues. And also, it's a good habit to get into, so you don't need to just do it when you've got no stamina left. You shouldn't be heavy attacking when you're nearly out of stamina. You should be heavy attacking all the time. So every time you get a heavy attack, always follow it up with a heavy. That way, you'll never get to the point where you've got sustain issues. Yeah, we're going to post the sustain guide link in the YouTube description. This is going to go on YouTube, so we'll post it in there. We'll also put it in the chat after if I remember and anyone asks for it. So gear. So this is a big one. So we'll talk about the gear. When you first start out with tanking, you should be using gear that gives you buff stats or healing until you're comfortable and you've got experience. Once you've got experience, you need to use group buff sets. Now, when you buff in a group, things die faster, everything's more comfortable. You're giving you group stuff that's gonna just end fights faster, and it's your benefit to end fights quicker as well. Like you're gonna sustain better, you're gonna be able to stay alive better. Everything is better when things die faster. So buffing your group is important, but when you're first learning a situation, when you're first learning to tank a fight, using selfish, self-healing, or buffing sets is okay. It's an okay thing to do. It's extremely bad advice for anyone who tells you otherwise, because if you don't know how to tank something and you just go in there with your Alkosh, with your powerful assault, those kinds of sets, which are extremely good sets that you need to get, but they're not good when you're learning, because you're probably not going to be able to keep any sort of uptime. You're not going to be able to keep any sort of buff. There's no point using sets that buff your group if you're not able to maintain them. What's the point? You need to use sets that you're comfortable with and learn how to do the fights, and then bring those in at a later date. Using a 5-piece healing set should be the last resort option that you do. So always consider trying something like a 2-piece healing monster set first before you start thinking about, right, I need to use a 5-piece Crest of Cyrodiil or whatever, or 5-piece Leeching. Like, that's the last resort. Try and use a monster set first that's going to boost your healing. And if that doesn't work, obviously you need the 5-piece healing gear set. Self-healing gear isn't the only useful gear for tank survival. Obviously, getting heals is fine, but there's lots of different buff sets, health boosting sets, situational gear that will keep you alive as well. So healing monster sets first of all. The main one is Earthgore. So the main healing monster set is Earthgore, and it's a really, really good one. It's like 35k's worth of healing every 20 seconds, which is just it's the best monster set you can use as a tank. If your health is low, so you go under 50% health, you heal yourself, and then you've got 35k's worth of healing for 10 seconds. Then you've got 10 seconds where it's not active, and then you can use it again 10 seconds later. So essentially, it's got a 50% uptime if you always take in lots of damage. Now, it's very good in certain trials and dungeons, and it's definitely worth considering as your main priority if you need a healing monster set. So Earthgore is number one for me. You've got Troll King, which is also decent. It's not as good as Earthgore, but it's situational. So it is going to give you health recovery, and you can stack your health recovery by using Troll King. It's just not as efficient in terms of the burst healing you're going to get. But it is going to add to your health recovery. So every 2 seconds, it's going to give you almost 1k's worth of extra healing. If you combine that with your other health recovery that you're already going to have, potentially 2 or 3k health recovery. Then you've got Malabeth, Scourge Harvester. That's going to give you a little bit of healing. You have to be in close range. So it's an option, but it's not useful in every situation because it's going to link up to an enemy and it's got a short range on it. But it is quite good for the extra buff as well. So you get Major Vitality and healing. So that is an option. Bogdan is not a very common monster set that you'll use on a tank for self-healing. But you could use it. Like, if you really wanted another healing monster set, you haven't got access to Earthgore, you haven't got the DLC, you can't do the dungeon, you can get Bogdan. It is going to do some healing. Another notable mention would be Chokethorn. Chokethorn could be used as another healing monster set, but it's not super reliable because it can link to other people. You do get healing from Engine Guardian and Stonekeeper as well. Those are monster sets that are sustained monster sets, but they also do heal. So Engine Guardian is actually quite a good one because it will often heal you. It also gives other resources. So if you're in a situation where sometimes you need healing, sometimes you need resources, it's got a bit of everything. So Engine Guardian can be a good one to use as a beginner player that needs healing, you need sustain. You could use that. We've also got other survival monster sets as well. Lord Warden's going to give you a buff on your resistances. It's going to give group buff on resistances. Thorvacan is going to do an area of effect, minor maim onto stack of ads or a stack of bosses or whatever, generally you'll use it on ad pulls where you've got a lot of ads and you can use the Vulcan. It'll debuff everything. But you can just replace that with things like Choking Talons that does the same effect. Vicosa, again, when you bash an enemy with that, you debuff the enemy, you've reduced their weapon and spell damage by 20%. Not a massive amount, but it can help a little bit. Lady Thorn, which is the new monster set, that does Major Maim as an area of effect, and it's 360 degrees as well, so you can run into a pack of ads, use it, debuff everything around you. Real nice way to reduce the damage of ads. When you've got a lot of ads in trials or dungeons, when you run into a big ad pack, you can just press the synergy, boom, and everything is reduced. Shadow Rend is another really good one, because that is like a really, really high uptime. So Lady Thorn's got a really low uptime, but it's for real, like, situational fights. So when you know when you're going to take a lot of damage, you'll use Lady Thorn. Shadow Rend is active almost all the time, and it's a permanent 5% damage reduction. So that is a really good monster set for reducing damage of bosses. You have got Mighty Chudan, which I generally wouldn't advise you to use, but it is the One Piece is good. If you combine the One Piece Mighty Chudan with a One Piece Lord Warden, that will give you more resistances if you need those. Then we've got Bloodspawn, which gives you ultimate and resistances. So it kind of works as a double thing, which can be nice for survival. Gear sets. Now, these aren't all gear sets that I would personally choose to use. I am a player that likes to optimize to help my group. Now, that's only because I'm an experienced player who has been playing the game for 6 years. If you were a new player, these are all sets that you might consider to keep yourself alive. There's lots of different ones. So let's start with the group buff survival sets. So the main priority, if you want to be working to help your group, but also provide some kind of buff, a good survival set is Eben, because it's going to increase your health, it's going to increase your group's health. Yolnahkriin is a good way to buff yourself and your group. So you're going to get Minor Aegis, which is going to reduce the damage you take, but also you're going to give Minor Courage to your group. So you're getting something that's going to reduce the damage for you and also give a group buff with the Courage. Other kind of group buff sets, which I personally don't use, but you can use. So Battalion Defender is going to heal you, sometimes heal other group members, so that's quite often used. It's not a great set, but it's one that you can use, and it's usually quite cheap to buy. Imperium gives us shield. Grave Guardian gives resistances. Automated Defense gives Major Aegis and things like that. So they're sets that kind of could help with your survivability. Some more useful than others. I personally wouldn't choose to use some of those, but they are options if you're struggling to survive, but you want to still help your group a little bit. Self-healing monster sets. Self-healing gear sets. Now, I don't use any of these myself. They are useful in different situations. They give different amounts of healing. There's different circumstances. Crest of Cyrodiil, for example, is a really good beginner set because it's really cheap to buy and it'll give you a big heal every time you block an attack every 4 seconds. So that could be a good set for trials, for example, when you're new in a trial. Getting an 8k heal every 4 seconds when you're blocking is not something to frown upon. Things like Bahara's Curse, things like Leeching Plate, good for dungeons because you've always got lots of ads in dungeons, you've always got lots of stuff. But yeah, there's lots of different kind of healing sets that will heal you. Those are the options that you've kind of got. Beekeeper gives you lots of health recovery, that sort of thing. Sets that give you buffs. Now you could decide that you want to use. You don't need a set that heals you, but you could use a set that you're trying to stay alive. You're struggling to stay alive, so you could use a gear set that helps you stay alive, but you don't need healing because the healing's okay. Something like something easy. Hist Bark is a decent set. It gives you major evasion, reduces your AoE damage by 25%. These are good sets for buffing yourself. They're not going to buff your group though. So they are selfish sets that you shouldn't use if you don't need them. But you can use them as a beginner tank going into content for the first time, as we've said already. Those are all gear sets that are going to be useful for that situation. So definitely consider some of these sets in the sets with buffs. They buff you. They should help you stay alive, but they're not very useful for your group. Other survival sets, if you're a beginner tank, for example, Fortified Brass, when you need a lot of resistances and you don't have any CP, you consider Fortified Brass. Plague Doctor, another one which gives you a nice big health boost. So having high health is really good in new content because it gives you more room for error. If you accidentally bar swap and you take a hit, for example, you shouldn't die unless it's a heavy attack or something like that. So those are the sets you can use, like other survival sets that give other kinds of buffs. Reactive armor, for example, when you get stunned, when you get crowd controlled, you take 33% less damage. So that could be useful in situations where there's a lot of CC to you and you're not very good at breaking free quickly and things like that. Before we go on to questions, the only last thing that I can really say is to make sure that you're always keeping your champion points for each situation like correct, because champion points do make a huge difference, especially Elemental Defender, Hardy, and Ironclad. So you should always make sure that you've got those CPs correct for the fight that you're in. If you're in a fight that's got lots of magic damage, make sure your CP is in the correct tree to deal with that, because CP does make a huge difference in your survival. We do have all CP tables on the tankclub.com, so make sure you check out the tankclub.com for those things if you need to see like the optimal CP for each situation. If anyone's got any questions, let me know in the chat now. We'll answer a few questions. Alkosh wasn't there. No, it wasn't. No. This is about staying alive as a tank, using Alkosh. Now, currently, this patch that we're in now, we're in the Stonethorn patch. Using Alkosh 100% is a must-have set, but only if you're experienced in the content that you're doing. If you're going into a trial for the very first time and you're not very good at keeping up Alkosh, what's the point in using it? If you've got a super low uptime, it's not going to keep you alive. You're going to keep dying. It's not really super important. At what point do you consider resistances to hit diminishing returns? It is a situational thing for you. You need to figure out if you're taking a lot of damage, you add to your resistances. If you're comfortably doing a trial with very little blocking, very little damage, then your resistances don't need to be really, really high. Resistances come out at the very end of the equation. This is the thing you need to remember. So blocking means that you've got like 50% less damage. Out of the 50% less damage that you take, you then work out your you've got all of those CPs. They come out next. Then your resistances come out. So your resistances are like the third thing to come out. So after you've managed to mitigate 75% of the damage from blocking and CP, the last 25% damage that you're taking, that's where your resistances come out, of the last 25%. So that's why you need to think about your resistances, because your resistances aren't the absolute be-all and end-all of tanking. You do need good resistances. They should be over 25k for most content. But you don't need to have 33k resistances for everything. You don't need it for doing Craglorn trials, the old dungeons. You don't need it for VMOL. You do need it for things like Cladrus Portals. You do need it for Kyne's Aegis. You do need it for VSS and things like that. But you don't need to be doing it for everything. You really need to just consider your situation, your damage, and what's the best way of combating that. When you first started tanking, very confused why balance cooldown was messed up. He was wearing Chudan. Yeah, so Chudan isn't really an advisable set. But yeah, you can use it. Learn a thing or two, that's good. Yeah, I mean, that's why we're here trying to do these, to try and help people learn stuff they didn't know. Even if you do know about tanking, then obviously sometimes you will learn something. I try and cover as much detail as I can and not make it too long, because this has been 45 minutes. I don't want to go more than an hour. But I did want to try and cram in as much detail as quickly as I can to try and hopefully help some people out. You've noticed in the logs your Alkosh procs, but it fades at 12. Is this a bug? So when you're looking at logs for Alkosh, you should be looking at the line breaker. That is when your Alkosh, because there's a few different things in the logs based on Alkosh. You've got Alkosh, which is the damage over time that you do. You've got Alkosh, which is the initial hit, and then you've got line breaker, which is the actual armor shred, which is the important one that you need to track. The CP passive guaranteed crit was an eye opener. Yeah, so even when you should always have that CP passive, you should look at your CP passives. That one particular one where you put 10 points into the apprentice gives you a guaranteed crit, guaranteed crit heal, guaranteed crit damage on a DD, but you generally would get that anyway if you're a Magicka DD. But yeah, even when you're placing your CP to optimize Alkosh 100%, for example, this patch you might have 100 points into Master Arms, 100 points into Mighty. You don't need to have those 100 points because you could take 1% out and put the points to make sure you've got 10 in the apprentice to get that guaranteed crit hit. And it works really well in things like VSS because the Fire Breath counts as a magic hit. So you go 1, 2, 3 ticks of Fire Breath, use your heal, it's a crit. And the same way in like Cloud Rest when you're in the portal, when all the orbs are exposed in the portal, the orb hits you, Zamarja Mind Blast you, then you've got a guaranteed crit heal because you've been hit by 3 Magicka projectiles. So it works out really nicely in some really high damage situations. What trait should I use if I'm using 2 medium sets? Alkosh and Powerful Assault. I mean, for survivability, you'd probably be better off using the Reinforced Chest and then using maybe a Reinforced Shield. The rest of it, I would be using Divines probably. But that's a personal preference. It's really up to you. I wouldn't, if I was using Alkosh and Powerful Assault, that would be assuming that I'm not really blocking very often. So I wouldn't be using a trait that's going to be like Sturdy. I wouldn't be using Sturdy because with 2 medium sets, I don't intend to really block. So I would personally choose Divines because the idea of running 2 medium sets is you're doing a bit of damage. So there'd be no point in running Alkosh and Powerful Assault if you're not intended on doing a bit of damage. You'd be better off playing it safer and using Eben and one of those sets. But really, there's not really many situations where you need 2 Alkoshes. There's not really many situations where you need to have Alkosh on the main tank, Alkosh on the off tank. Like, it's very rare that you actually need to do that. Notice you didn't include the CP passive that gives ult when dodging an attack. Yeah, I mean, Mighty and Master Arms is where we're at with CP at the minute because of Alkosh. That obviously will change, but also gaining ultimate and stuff like that isn't a priority for surviving because only the DK really benefits from the ultimates. Do you know what I mean? When you get all your resources, you can use an ultimate. It heals you, it gives you all your resources back. And that's only actually useful on a DK. On other classes, obviously, you would generally not slot an ultimate that would be doing that, where it's going to give you that survivability because you try and just heal yourself and things like that. So that would only really be gaining ultimate is only really useful for survival on a DK. But like really, chest traits reinforced for more armor. It's really down to you, Johnny. Again, if you feel like you're taking a lot of damage in a situation, you would go for the reinforced chest because it's the only slot really that's 100% worth using reinforced because it's such a big slot and it gives you so much extra resistances. You don't need to have it, but if you want to hit that, if you want to get close to 33k, that is the main way to do it. How do I know if an attack is magic or physical? Well, physical attacks usually are at melee range or with a bow attack. Magic attacks are usually ranged-based attacks. It is difficult to know which ones are magic or physical, but the best way is just to have the passive there. And then, usually, if you've taken 3 hits of anything, you're going to be quite low on health. So it's just nice to have that particular CP passive. So if you do take 3 magic hits, you're going to be prepared or ready to crit heal. Should you hold block lots or only during heavy hitting attacks? It really depends on the trial and the content. I personally don't block all the time, so it depends how well you know a fight. You're not going to be able to go into a fight and not hold block straight away if you're new in a fight. Which you're experienced in certain trials and certain dungeons, you don't need to block all the time. And it's advised that you don't do that as well if you don't need to, because the whole time you're blocking, you're just wasting resources, because every time you get hit with a light attack that doesn't really do much damage, you're losing however much stamina it is that your block cost is. So if your block cost is 700 stamina, you're standing there just blocking and you don't need to, and you know that you don't need to, and you're aware of the situation. You're just wasting 700 stamina every time you get hit. But you could avoid that just by not blocking if you know that you don't need to. But I mean, quite often you do need to block in a lot of situations, and there is a lot of high damage environments where you do need to block a lot, and that's where sustain comes in, and that's where the sustain guide would be beneficial to take a look at. If you're using divines on 2 medium sets, what stone are you using? It really did everything's so dependent on the situation. I would use probably the Shadow or the Atronach if I need the mag recovery, or the Lady if I'm going to be dealing with a reasonable amount of damage and I need resistances, but I'm using 2 medium sets. You can use the Lady Munderstone for the extra resistances. Sunspire ads, you're going to be blocking. Yeah, you're going to be blocking a lot for Sunspire ads, Kind's Aegis ads. Those kinds of things, you do need to block a lot. So that's where you've got to consider that.